Okay, hello English Lit students. This is a revision context PowerPoint about attitudes and ideas about crime in the US around the time that In Cold Blood was written. Okay, so we're going to look at two different explanations for crime. We're going to look at sociological explanations, and we're also going to talk about psychological explanations. So just to sort of explain those two different approaches, sociological explanations look to social conditions to explain crime. And we're going to look at three that were fairly well established in American ideas about crime by the 1950s and 60s. They come under the headings of social disorganization, strain or anomie, and the idea of subcultures. We're also going to talk about psychological explanations, which were also very widespread. These look to not sociology, not to society, but to processes within an individual's mind. So processes and drives within the mind or the psyche, which is where you get psychology from. We're going to think about the Freudian psychoanalytical explanations, and we're also going to think about some of the ideas about insanity or psychopathology, which can explain really terrible crime. So, a Chicago school, i.e. within a university, a way of thinking about crime developed at Chicago University, so it's called the Chicago School. Now, the date here is 1942, but obviously these ideas take a long time, 10, 20 years to filter into wider society, okay? And what they were looking at was the residential locations of juvenile criminals. A lot of the concern, particularly after the Second World War, was about juvenile crime, juvenile delinquency. What they found were patterns of delinquency were higher in areas with poor housing, poor health, socioeconomic disadvantage, and transient populations. So what that suggests is that crime is not down to individuals, because if it was just something within individuals, you would expect it to be spread across all areas of society. So it suggested that crime was a function of neighbourhood dynamics, not necessarily individual actors and their actions. And then another approach that's sociological comes from the idea of anomie, which was also described using the word strain. So there's a sociologist called Durkheim, and he came up with this concept of anomie, which literally means having no norms. Yeah, so in sociology, you're often thinking about what are the norms in society and how are they passed on. And he explained the breakdown of social norms which accompanies rapid social change. And you could definitely suggest that America was going through rapid social change in the 1950s and then into the 1960s when In Cold Blood is written, particularly the post-war affluence and the economic boom. Another sociologist, Merton, argued that crime occurs due to the gap between the goals of a society and then the means to achieve those goals. So American society in the 1950s, we've talked about this, was very much about the perfect American dream life. And a lot of that was around materialism, but also successful family life. So if you think about the American dream, in the 1950s, I would link it to these two things: material wealth and consumption, but also successful heterosexual marriage and family. So wealth and status, and then how do you get those? Well, you need education and you need employment. If you can't access the education and the employment, you can't access the goals of the society. So this is what he described as strain. This strain between the means and the goals results in frustration and resentment and encourages the use of illegitimate or illegal means to secure success if the other means are barred from you. So the cultural values and the social structures of society seem to actually be responsible for individual citizens to commit crime. And then the idea of a subculture, and that's a picture of a New York street gang, if you're wondering, of juvenile delinquents there in the corner from the 1950s. US sociologists also used the concept of status frustration. Hope you can see how all these theories are kind of linked as well. This was to explain delinquent activities of disadvantaged groups in the 1950s and the 1960s, right when our book is written and set. A chap called Cohen conducted research into group offending by young lower class men. Okay, so that's almost like gangs, you might say, but offending together in a group. What he found was because they could not aspire to middle class cultural goals, they rejected them and then created their own system of values. And that's called a subcultural system of values. It's not the values of mainstream society. It's a completely opposite, in many ways, set of values. Those are our main sociological explanations for crime. And I hope, as I went through them, you were thinking about Perry and Dick Hickok and how Capote gives us lots of information to see those sorts of explanations at work. On the other hand, there are also very widespread Freudian beliefs and psychological understanding in America in the 1950s and 1960s, and these were also used to explain crime and criminal impulses. So if we think about Freud and then other psychoanalysts who sort of followed his pattern, there are these three forces that he felt that work in the mind. The id is this very primitive, sometimes people call it the caveman brain or cave woman, cave person. And these are our instinctual drives: lust, violence, greed. Yeah, we all have them, Freud would say. We've all got them and they do drive us. However, we also have a superego. And this is the restraints on our behaviour. You can think of it being like your conscience. And children internalise these restraints on their behaviour as a result of having love and attachment to your parents. So that was really important for Freud in creating a sort of well-functioning mind and behaviour. The ego is the rational and conscious self that mediates between the drives of the id and the restraints of the superego. So those are the key words in Freud, and you can see how these could apply to crime. So criminality, if you're a psychoanalyst, is largely explained as a failure of the superego. And this you won't have a very good functioning superego because if you fail to form healthy and loving attachments to your parents. There's a chap called Erik Erikson. He expanded on Freud's theory and explained delinquency as an identity crisis created by inner turmoil. And so by the 50s, psychopathology, that is the explaining crime through psychology, had become quite understood and widespread in popular culture. And this film poster is for a film released in 1960 called Psycho. And I think that's quite handy to give you an idea of how widespread these ideas and these beliefs were. They were new, but they were getting spread. And there was a psychologist called Cleckley, and he'd produced a checklist in 1941 for diagnosing psychopathology. That is somebody who is maybe a psychopath. Yeah, you know the phrase psychopath. Yeah. And these are things he suggested you should look out for, or you should use to diagnose someone being a psychopath. A lack of insight into the effect of one's behaviour on others, superficial charm, a lack of anxiety, and a failure to plan ahead. Bear in mind, not every psychopath is a murderer. Okay, there's this terrible idea now that lots of very successful business people are psychopaths. I don't know how true that is, but people say it. So yeah, psychopaths are not necessarily murderers. Okay, so what you're going to do with these contexts? Yeah, what I think would be a really good idea is to now look at both Perry. Oh, Perry and Smith. I'm so sorry. You know what I mean. Perry and Hickok. I'll go back and fix that. How does he suggest that their crimes are a result of social forces? So can you see how these sociological explanations could be used to explain Dick and Perry's behaviour? Now, be specific. Don't just say for both of them. look specifically at each of them and think about what do we know about their social background and how far these apply to each of them. How does he suggest maybe they're the result of psychological forces? So have a look at that individual mind and psyche of each of them and see how far those apply to them. And then think about this in contrast to the Moonstone. Think about the reasons for crime that are suggested by Collins in the Moonstone. And you can see a big contextual difference there, how attitudes to crime and criminals have changed over 100 years. I'm sorry, there are a couple of typos on these slides. I will fix them before I give you the slides, but the lecture's going to stay with those dodgy typos. Okay, thank you guys.